Welcome back. China's latest investment in African infrastructure, the Mombasa-Nairobi Railway, is up and running. So how is China's commitment to Africa playing out in other parts of the continent? Still with us, Aly-Khan Satchu is an economist and CEO of the East African financial company Rich Management. Chen Chenchen is Deputy Director for the Department of Macroeconomics at Renmin University. Adetunji Omotola is an analyst in Pan-African affairs. And with us in the studio, Yun Sun is a Senior Associate in the East Asia program at the Stimson Center. Let's get back to our panel. Ali, I want to get back to you. If we look at the big picture here, the broad investment that China has in Africa, President Xi Jinping committed something like $60 billion in development loans and funds to African leaders in 2015. That's a very large sum of money. How do you think that could best be utilized across the African continent?
Well, I think firstly I would like to draw a distinction between the African engagement prior to Xi Jinping. I think, you had a very different nature of engagement. There were quite a freewheeling component to it. And I think just as the president has brought discipline within the Chinese system, he brought discipline to that relationship between China and Africa. And now clearly the letterbox is the president, it is in Beijing. And that's the first important thing to note. There are some issues, legacy issues. China was a very big lender to commodity-based countries. Today, Angola is under significant pressure to pump more fuel to make up the shortfall in those loans that were securitized by commodities. I like what I'm seeing out of Xi Jinping. I think there's a very clear vision, and I think there's a very good execution capacity in there now. So I look at the Chinese relationship under Xi Jinping as fundamentally having evolved and become more mature. And the example I would give you today is it's not just about building the infrastructure, it's about making the cash available in a speedy manner. It's about raising debt finance for a lot of these frontier economies. Today, China is a big debt arranger for these frontier economies. So it's a much more sophisticated product suite other than just stadiums, cement, and railways. It's actually bringing long-term financing into the game. I think for a long time our leaders thought China was Santa Claus. They need to be disavowed of that notion. They need to negotiate in the national interest. But I'm seeing more maturity amongst the leaders as well. And for Africa, the more players, the more people we have at the table, the better deal we can do. And China has been, has muscled in and has really made available what's required in a way which we haven't seen before. And I think that's the game changer as well.
Chen, I want to get back to something that we were talking about earlier on, and that is the Belt and Road Initiative. How do these projects in Africa fit in with that overall project?
Well, China's ultimate insight about Belt and Road Initiative is to bring out the potential for the global economic growth. Well, now if you look at the dynamics of global economy, apparently the future growth, the stimulus for that lies in South-South cooperation. And if you want to stimulate the economic growth in underdeveloped regions, especially in regions like Africa, of course, you want to make sure that the smooth regional traffic or infrastructure network is available. Otherwise, if you don't have even the standard gauge railways, how can you interconnect different railways or different highways, even different airways in the future? So I think the infrastructure implementation is currently the stage one for the whole BRI implementation. And in the future, with a very developed infrastructure network, of course, we can expect facilitated investment, facilitated trade, and ultimately the vigor of South-South cooperation could lead to more stimulating of global economic growth.
Yun-Sun, at what point does these kind of investments and projects that China is involved in right now translate into sort of secondary industries, manufacturing in Africa, for instance?
That is a hope, because eventually for this trade to take off, the railway cannot just be built to transport passengers from one place to another, right? So I think both African countries and China are aimed at the long-term revenue generation effect and the trade facilitation effect of this type of infrastructure projects. And it's also the manufacturing business that will foster employment, which is a big issue for a lot of African countries currently. They have a youth population that are currently, a lot of them are unemployed. So for China, they do identify this as the next cycle of the potentials that African countries have to release.
Adetunji, how different is the Chinese investment in Africa from, let's say, the more traditional investors from Europe and the United States?
Well, look, we all know that the West is the foundation for most of what Africa is. In fact, what Africa aspires to in terms of a society where there's railways, there's electricity, there's great airports and so on. Of course, China is also very developed, so that Eastern model also applies. But the West does not give support to Africa in the same way that China does, because they attach a lot of conditions. And also the loans that they give to African countries, you all know about the IMF and the World Bank, it's very prescriptive, and many times, in fact, African countries could not even service the debt, and so they had to do debt relief, and they had to have countries like Ghana come onto IPIC and come off IPIC, which is heavily indebted poor countries. So the West has always loaned money to Africa with a lot of pain attached to it, a bitter pill attached to it. That's why the Chinese investment in Africa is more welcome, it's faster, even though people are suspicious of it, especially the West. But what we would like to see is for African leaders to pursue most of the money that has been stolen from Africa, because after all, if China has invested maybe plus or minus $100 billion in the last decade, more than $500 billion has been stolen from Africa, and Thabo Mbeki is busy trying to find that money. So I think that's the money that we need to find in Africa and work with the Chinese, and maybe the West will come to the party quicker over the next few years.
Ali, South Africa is currently the largest hub for foreign direct investment in Africa. Do you expect that to change?
The current situation with a politically limping ANC, political risk which has gone sky high, and I think developments in the last 10 years when people no longer see the south of Africa as the gateway to Africa, they now see an eastern gateway, which is Kenya, a western gateway, which is Nigeria and Ghana, North Africa through Egypt, and South Africa has been dissolved in that new reality. And I think what we're watching now is South Africa losing its pole position, essentially, and big countries like China prepared to bet on other countries in Africa as their new gateways and as multiple gateways onto such an enormous continent which has so much opportunity.
Chen Chen, sustainable development is one of the major features of the 2030 UN Sustainable Development Goals. It's also a cornerstone, of course, of China's own domestic development. So how important is sustainable investment for Africa?
Well, if you identify the demand for now in Africa, of course, there's huge demand for infrastructure construction. But if you look at the traditional financing channels, the financing for infrastructure projects has been very inadequate. Well, the Chinese banks are coming up with very flexible and smart ways to finance such projects and makes it more sustainable. I think that is the lifeline of such projects, and that is the only way to make sure that such cooperation could be sustainable also in the future. I think currently when the Chinese side and the African side sit down and talk about the smooth financing channels, they are also looking into the future. For example, in the future, if the local government is not able to pay back, whether the loans should be transferred into public debt. So I think both sides are still in the middle of exploring. I think in the future there will be more flexible ways to guarantee that the sustainable investment and cooperation is there for Africa.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for joining us. That's all we have time for, but the conversation continues online. Chat with us about this or any other show on Twitter. We're at CGTN America, or visit us on Facebook. That's facebook.com/CGTN America. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.